Good morning. My name is Caleb, and I'm one of the pastors here. I'd love to meet you after service if I haven't met you yet. And we are finishing out our series in Genesis. Okay, we've been in it all summer long. So if you're just visiting for the first time, this is where we've been all summer, working chapter by chapter through the book of Genesis. And today, what we are going to focus on in our section of Genesis is the fact that who you are with makes a big difference. So who you're with matters. All right, and if you think about it, if you're experiencing a difficult time, if you're struggling with something in your life, having close friends or family with you is really helpful, right? They can comfort you, they can give you good guidance in that difficult situation. And the same is true on the flip side. If you're experiencing success, sharing that with friends and family can make it even sweeter. And this past week, the Big Ten Network was interviewing a bunch of Ohio State football players from the national championship team, and they asked them what did they like the most about winning the national championship. Obviously, winning's great, but they said, like, what made it so special to you? And the things that they said was, one, sharing it with their teammates, right? That they felt like a brotherhood there. But the second thing that almost all of them said was sharing it with their moms, right? Sharing it with their moms was one of the sweetest things for so many of these big football players. They said, sharing this moment with my mom was really special, right? So who we are with makes a big, big difference, right? And that's what we're going to see in our passage today, that who our main characters are with and who they know that they're with or doubt that they're with makes a big difference. And what we're really going to focus on today is the fact that God goes with his people wherever they may be. God goes with his people wherever they're at. Because in Genesis chapter 46, which is where we were last week, we see God promises to Jacob that he will be with him as he goes down into Egypt. He will be there with him. And his presence will make a difference for him. That's something he's supposed to rest in. So if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis 47, that's where we're going to be today. We'll be in Genesis chapter 47, and we're going to be starting in verse 1. And as you are turning there, I'll just give us some cliff notes. If you weren't with us this summer, we spent a lot of time walking through the story of Genesis, but here is the cliff notes of what's happened in the life of Joseph so far. So first of all, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Not a great thing to do to your brother, right? So that happened, and then he was very successful under his master, and he rose to the top. Okay, so he was very successful. And then what happened is he was falsely accused of a crime, put in prison for years, and suffered there, still trusted God in the midst of all this. And then eventually he has an opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and then this allows him to be catapulted to the top of Egyptian society, and now he is second only to the king of Egypt, or Pharaoh. And after all that drama has happened, okay, as if that wasn't enough in his life, he then sees his brothers who are suffering in a famine. They don't have enough food. And so his brothers have come to Egypt. They don't know it's him. And there's this, when will they figure out that it's Joseph kind of tension. And after a couple trips back and forth, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, and it's kind of a sweet reunited moment. And in our section last week, we saw Joseph and his father Jacob be reunited. Okay? And that all sounds good, and it sounds like, what could go wrong now? The family's back together, it's all good, right? But there's still one problem that we have. There's still one thing that's holding them back. They don't have permission yet to actually stay in Egypt long term. Okay? And Joseph has kind of hatched a plan with his brothers and his family. And what we're going to jump into today is the execution of said plan. Will Pharaoh let them stay long term or not? And so that is where we're going to be jumping in to the story today. And so here's what we see in Genesis 47, starting in verse 1. It says, "So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, 'My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen.' And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen, and if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers, in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. And we'll pause there. All right. So up to this point in Genesis, we've bounced back between different locations of Canaan and Egypt. But from here onward, we're just going to be in Egypt for the rest of Genesis. All right, and in this Egypt location, we see Joseph executes his plan of talking to Pharaoh to get them temporary residency in Egypt. So essentially, they're like doing the ancient equivalent of applying for a visa in the land of Egypt. So they're looking for short-term residency. Okay, we see that with the word sojourning, or ge'ur, is what they're looking for here. So they're looking for short-term stay. So they're understanding the promises of God. Because if we look previously in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have all been promised a specific land by God in Canaan. And so they're asking for the short-term stay because they know the promise of God is that they will one day return to the land that they have been promised. Okay? So that's what we see here. And so with desiring this short-term stay from Pharaoh, you might think that the brothers and Joseph would lie about their occupation. Okay, in previous chapters, we've talked about how the Egyptians were kind of prejudiced against the Hebrews. They didn't really like them. And one of those reasons might be that they were shepherds, or their specific way that they were shepherds in the Hebrew context. So it might have been advantageous for them to kind of say, yeah, we just take care of livestock, generally speaking, right? We just take care of animals, right? There's words in Egyptian and Hebrew for those type of things, right? They could have just said that, left out the full truth. But no, they're honest. They tell them exactly what they do and what their fathers do. And they don't make the same mistake that Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham and his grandfather Isaac make, right? Because those two men went into a foreign land, talked with the leader of that land, and lied in order to have some level of protection. So they don't quite make that same mistake, but they're faithful to be honest and trust that God is going to do what he's going to do. All right? And so Pharaoh then approves this short-term stay, and beyond the approval, this family is abundantly blessed by God. They receive way more than they're asking for. Because Pharaoh could have just said, I'll give you whatever leftovers there are in the land of Goshen, in the land of Ramses. I'll just give you whatever is there, just kind of the scraps. But no, he says, you can have the best of this land. So not only does he approve their stay, but he gives them the best land for their flocks. So that they're blessed in that way. Additionally, Pharaoh gives them kind of a job offer, right? He says, you can take care of my livestock. Right? That's a high-level position. If you're working directly with the king of Egypt or with Pharaoh, that's a prestigious position. So that's another way that they're blessed. And if this wasn't enough, on top of it, Joseph gives them an allotment in the land. He gives them a possession of the land. So there's just blessing on blessing on blessing for this family. And so that they receive all these blessings from God, and it demonstrates God's presence with this family. God is with them as they go. He is blessing them. But speaking of blessings, we have someone other than God giving a blessing here, right? Jacob gives two blessings to Pharaoh, one at the beginning of the interaction and one at the end. And this is actually quite rare to see this word barak, blessing, in the context of a person blessing another person. More often than not in Genesis, God is the one who's blessing others. That's a constant theme in Genesis. God blesses his people over and over again, and our text today demonstrates that. But here, a good way to think about Jacob's blessing is that he is thanking God for Pharaoh, and he's asking God to continue to provide his grace upon Pharaoh, right? They've already been somewhat saved from this famine, but he's asking for grace upon Pharaoh, maybe not in a salvific way or to save them in like the context of a special relationship with God, but to provide good things for them and the best for them. So Jacob blesses Pharaoh. And after this first blessing, Pharaoh asks Jacob a question, right? He asks him basically, how old are you? He does it in like a riddle type way, but he asks him, how old are you? And in our context, that would come off as pretty rude, right? If somebody looks old, you generally don't ask them how old they are. That's just what you shouldn't do, okay? That's what our context is. But in the ancient world, asking somebody how old they are is a good thing. It's trying to show honor to the other person because the older you were, the more esteemed and respected you were because they associated age with wisdom. Okay, and it's probably something our culture could learn from their culture is respect for your elders, right? That's something that was really ingrained in their culture. So he's trying to honor Jacob by asking him how old he is. But Jacob's response is not great, okay? He kind of complains right to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was probably not expecting, oh, my life's been terrible and everything sucks. But that's basically what Jacob says, right? My life's been bad, right? And it really should cause you to evaluate, is Jacob really, is he accurate or is he just having an attitude right now? Does he need kind of an adjustment here? And if you really look into it, he says, my years have only been 130, which is technically true, okay? That's a technically true statement, but it's painted through the glasses of negativity and having a bad attitude, right? Because 130 years is, one, a long time in our context, but it's also a long time in their context, okay? You can look pre-flood and you see all these long ages and things like that, but at this point in time, 130 years is a very, very long time. And if you look at some Egyptian texts from around this period, 110 years was kind of viewed as an ideal age. So in the guy he's speaking to, 110 would have been a great number, and he's 20 years past that. So he's just painting it through the lens of negativity. But beyond that, he says the years of his life have been evil. Is that really true? Is it really true? And we think the first thing that he's really suffered through is his conflict with his brother Esau. His brother Esau said, I'm going to kill you. Okay, and Esau was a scary guy. He was a hunter, and so you don't exactly want him saying he's going to kill you. Okay, but they've worked through that. All right, they've worked through their issues and their family drama, and they've reconciled. And Esau has forgiven Jacob for the things he's done to him, and they kind of had a healing moment where they reunited, and they also buried their father together, and it was sweet. And they've worked through that issue. Okay. And we think the other really major suffering in his life is when he thought that Joseph had died, right? He thought his son had died, and his favorite son. Not a good thing, again, but, he had a favorite son, and he thought he died. But we have Joseph right in front of him. We know he's not dead, and we now have the hindsight to see that the suffering with Joseph was for a purpose to actually save his entire family, and if Joseph hadn't had that happen to him, probably his whole family would die. And so really Jacob's entire lens is that of negativity. And he doesn't see the amazing things that God has right in front of his face, right? All this blessing, that his family is now safe. They have security in the land under Pharaoh. They have wealth, even though famine is all around them. They are just blessed so abundantly, it is clear that God is with them. but he can't help but just focus on his bitterness and negativity, despite the blessings around them. Right? So Jacob is negative despite God abundantly blessing his people. But let's kind of zoom out as we pick up in verse 13 and see what's happening in the world around them. What's happening in Egypt more broadly, picking up in verse 13. And here's what it says. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are all my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and the land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the lands of the priests did he not buy, but the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. And we'll pause there. All right, so we kind of have 3 cycles of famine here, and our initial impulse as readers might be to say, why couldn't we just have a summary paragraph that said this is what happened, right? Because it'd be much more expedient. It would save space. Writing in the ancient world is expensive, right? So why not just summarize it? But I think this repetition is very intentional, and it demonstrates several things. First, it shows us how severe the famine actually is, right? It continually says, the land is languishing, the famine is very severe, okay? So it really tries to hit home. This is really bad. So it's very bad. The other thing it demonstrates to us is Joseph's wisdom, right? His decision-making ability, what he's willing to offer and negotiate in the role that he's been given. Because his role is to essentially, on the one hand, make Pharaoh, his boss, happy and make sure he's getting what he needs and that the country is being run well. And the other thing that he's supposed to be doing is making sure that the land of Egypt doesn't just fall apart and everybody dies, okay? So kind of a stressful job if you think about it, right? So, keeping that many people alive is probably quite stressful. And we see he kind of makes these various decisions as they're negotiating. So, right, the first thing is they run out of money. And so they then say, we're going to move to livestock. Okay, Joseph offers up the livestock. But then the third one kind of makes us uncomfortable in our cultural context, right? So why were they willing to basically sell themselves? So what we have here is maybe more like indentured servitude right here. That's kind of what they're doing. And it's a good way to think of it is people who maybe lived in England and then were indentured servants to pay for the voyage to the New World. That's a good way to think about what they're doing here. And so sometimes more critical readers can say, well, this is Joseph taking advantage of people in a bad situation, right? These people don't really have a choice in the matter. That's what some people would say as they read this. But I'd like to point out several things. First of all, the people themselves suggest this solution. Joseph doesn't suggest it, right? They say, let's do this. This is our agreement. They're the ones offering it. So that's an important factor. Joseph is not the one who says this. Secondly, you got to think about what's the long-term play? What's the long-term solution if he just continues to just give out of the storehouses? Are people going to start hoarding the food and not actually need it? Right? They don't have the type of technology that we have to keep track of records and things like that. So what is this really a long-term solution? And then the third thing is that culturally, this would be a very normal situation. Okay, if you go into debt or something, that you'd be like a servant for somebody for X amount of years. That's something that's very culturally normal. And the last thing I'd point out about this section too is that 20% culturally is very low. Okay, if you read things like the Code of Hammurabi and other things like that, the general going price for this would be somewhere between a third and a half. Okay, so 20% is a deal for these people, relatively speaking, in their cultural context. All right, so I think we can say safely that Joseph is not really taking advantage of them here. They're the ones offering the deal. They agree to it. They seem quite content with it when they say, "You have saved our lives," basically thanking him for it. And so I don't think Joseph is really taking advantage of people. But I don't think that any of that is necessarily the main point of our text, but it's helpful to think through those things because that can get us caught up on this passage. But I really think the purpose of this section is to contrast the first section we read with the second section that we read. So to contrast the situation of God's people and the situation of the people around them. Right? So we see God's presence with the people of God, with Jacob, Joseph, their family. They're abundantly blessed. But then we see Egypt, and God is giving them what we might call in theology common grace, okay? A level of grace that God extends to everyone. I believe it's in Romans where it says God makes it rain both on the wicked and the righteous type of idea, okay? And so that's a way that God extends grace even though people don't necessarily deserve it. Okay, so God's extending some level of grace to the Egyptians. He's not allowing them to be wiped out. But we still see the contrast between the people of God and the people surrounding them in Egypt, that God has a special blessing and presence with his people and in the middle of how bad this famine is. And this really serves to really increase our value of what's happening with the people of God, or really help us understand the magnitude of the blessing of God, because we see the contrast of the people around them. The people around them, it's a struggle, it's hard, but everything seems to be going abundantly well, what you would expect during a famine for the people of God. So we see that God is present with his people here. But let's just close out our section with verses 27 to 31 as we think about God being present with them. Here's what it says. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." He answered, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And that's the end of our text for today. Okay, so again, this just serves as another contrast to the previous section. Things are going great for Jacob and his family. And in fact, it's drawing upon the previous promises made to Jacob. They're being fruitful and they're multiplied because God has promised to Jacob that his family will become a great nation. So they're expanding, they're growing. God is abundantly there and present and blessing these people. Okay, and then we kind of have a weird thing where it's, Jacob talks about putting your hand under your thigh and all that type of different stuff. I don't want to get too much into that, but it's just a cultural thing that would really say, yes, I really mean it, similar to like putting your hand on the Bible if you're about to be under oath in court. Okay, it's saying that there will be consequences if I lie about this. That's essentially what they're saying. So God is going to bring down consequences on me if I don't come through with this, is essentially what they're saying, okay? That is the whole promise situation, all right? And this really should remind us of the previous section, because Jacob seems to really doubt whether God is with him, right? We saw that in the very first section where he's kind of said, my life's been terrible. And then here, he does not trust that God will bring him back to the promised land. But in Genesis 46:4, God says, I will go down with you into Egypt. I'll be present there. And he says, I will bring you back up out of Egypt too. I will bring you out. So God has promised to go with him in and bring him back out. But Jacob seems to have some trust issues with God here, right? He does not seem to really believe, although that God directly has said to him, this will happen. Jacob is still struggling to really believe that this is going to happen. And so he makes Joseph swear that I will actually do this. And it's kind of interesting too, because he says that twice, basically, swear to me, do this process where it means you really mean it. Even though Joseph has done nothing but really help him out the entire time. I don't know why he doubts him so much. Joseph has been so good and faithful to him. And in the midst of this tension with Jacob, it kind of ends with almost a little bit of passing of the torch between Jacob and Joseph, right? Because one, we see Jacob bows to Joseph, his son, which culturally, we understand Joseph's in a high authority here, but Jacob's still his father and still someone to be respected by Joseph. So it's kind of a changing of the dynamic. And Jacob also uses language of, if I find favor in your sight, which is something you typically do to an authority over you, right? And so there's almost a little transition of power dynamic in the family relationship, which sets us up for when we get to chapter 48. So look forward to that next summer, right? So we'll get there. We'll finish one of these days, right? So, yes. So what, though? So what? We see God's presence with these people, but what does that do for our lives? How do we live in light of God's presence with his people? And I think first thing is just we need to remember that God is present. We need to remember that because we're so quick to forget things like that. We often are more like Jacob than we are Joseph, right? We often are like Jacob and something bad happens to us and then we just paint everything through a negative lens around us. Things might be going great, but this one bad thing happened to us and so we just can't let go of it. And that's what Jacob's doing here. Whereas we have Joseph, who is a prime example of someone who trusts God and knows that God is present, despite the fact that he has more reason than anyone in his family to doubt God's presence, right? He's such a good example of that. And it almost makes it hard to relate to him because he does such a good job, right? We often more are like Jacob. And so remembering God's presence for us as people who are trusting in Jesus, who have faith in Jesus, and are submitting to Jesus as King, God's presence is a positive. It's a great thing for us. It's something we can lean into, right? The God of the universe, the God who created everything in Genesis 1 and 2, is there with us as those who trust in him. It's something we can lean on in hard times, right? God is with us when we talk to our coworkers about our faith and they ask difficult questions. God is with us when our friends make fun of us for what we believe. God is there. He is present always. And that should be an encouragement to us as we are going throughout our days. Even though it might seem just like a simple everyday thing, God is there with us. And we just need to continually spend time in prayer is a good way to remember God's presence with you. Regularly have times of extended prayer once a week where you can just really lean into God. That is a good way to remember God's presence. Because prayer is recognizing that, one, there's someone else there, right? You're having a conversation with God. And two, it's also saying, I don't have it all figured out, right? God is there and he does have it figured out. He has the full picture and he's present with me. So having a regular pattern of prayer is a really practical way to remember God's presence. But if we're honest, God's presence is not a positive if we do not have faith in Jesus, right? Yes, we may have common grace like the Egyptians did, right? We may have some blessings that God's provide, but God's presence also means he sees everything that we do, he knows everything that we think, and he knows the attitude of our hearts at all times. And if we're really honest, that's a terrifying thing, right? That's just, we're honest, right? Because we know how messed up we are, right? And the reality is, if we are not in Christ, if we don't have faith in Jesus, that should be terrifying for us, right? Because we sit under God's judgment. We're not in right relationship with God. And we see that in Genesis 3, that even though God is not present in the garden, he's still there. He still sees what they do, right? But the good news is also in Genesis 3, God has made a way for this relationship to be made right. The God who is present pursues us too, right? He wants us to be in right relationship. He doesn't want his presence to be that terrifying thing, the terrifying weight of knowing we have a rift in that relationship. But he wants it to be a joy. He wants his presence to be good. He wants it to be something we look forward to in our daily lives. And he has extended that to us if we have faith in Jesus. Everyone is welcome into this beautiful presence of God if they just have faith. And that's the wonderful thing about God's presence. But on the other hand, it's not enough to just remember, okay? It's not enough to just intellectually think something. But this also means we have to have a heart change. So we have to have an attitude that reflects God's presence as well. And that's one of the prime mistakes we see with Jacob, right? He has a horrible attitude. He sees everything as bad in his life, despite the fact that God has blessed him so greatly. Okay, and so if you think about it, would Pharaoh ever want to worship the God of Jacob? Right? If this is your interaction, if this is the representation of God as Jacob, would Pharaoh ever want to worship that God? Probably not, because Jacob says his life sucks and everything, and he hasn't lived long enough, right? He sounds entitled and grumpy, right? And so who wants to worship that God? And so your attitude sometimes has a bigger impact on your ability to live on mission than you might think, right? And so we see this in our passage today, that our attitude reflects whether we really accept God's presence with us. And the mark of a follower of God is joy in trials. And this is what James 1 says, count it all joy when we face various trials. That the mark of a true follower is one who trusts in God's presence when things are bad. And this doesn't mean we just stick our heads in the sand and just are ignorant and say, everything's great, even though everything's burning down around us, right? Like that one meme of the dog and the flyer house, you know what I'm talking about. That's we're not like that. We're not ignorant of the difficult things that are happening, right? But it is saying that God is there with me. I know he's in control, and I know he's working in the midst of the pain and the suffering I'm going through. Right? That's what Joseph did in his entire life. He said, I know things are bad, but I know God is with me, and I know he's working in it. And maybe at this moment, he doesn't see the full picture, because God only has the full picture, right? And that's one of the lessons of Joseph's life, that God is the only one who has that full picture. But God is there with you, even when you don't know what's going to happen in the end. God is there with you when it gets really hard. And he allows us to have an attitude change to that of joy and perspective that God is there in light of the difficulty. Okay? And I think a really practical example of this is my father-in-law's best friend. Chris is his name, and we call him Uncle Chris. Okay, and so he was driving with my brother-in-law and his son one day. And so they're just driving along just like a normal day with the two boys in the back seat. And then the driver in front of them just slams on the brakes and he rear ends them, okay? And so my brother-in-law, here's how he tells the story. He says, Uncle Chris just took a deep breath and went, and then he said, praise God, right? That's like, and it wasn't in like a trite, simple sort of way, but it's in a way that this man's been so affected by God and his presence that even when something bad happens, his initial knee-jerk reaction is just to say, God is here and God is doing something, right? And that's what I would like to be like, right? And isn't that what we would all like to be like? That when hard things happen, our initial reaction is to turn towards God and say, he's doing something even though this is hard, right? Because he didn't want to get in a car accident. Who wants that, right? But God was there with him, and he had the proper attitude in that situation. So we needed to have an attitude that reflects God's presence. And then finally, we need to act in light of God's presence. So one, we need to remember intellectually, yes, God is with me. And then two, we need to have our attitudes changed by that. But then we actually need to act upon this, right? We need to go and do things in light of this. And Jacob's kind of the non-example of this, right? He kind of just lets things happen to him, or at least that's his perspective. This stuff's just happening around me. Whereas Joseph continues to strive and do his best, despite the circumstances being terrible. He's a great example of joy, wisdom, patience, kindness, even when others around him don't deserve it, even though everything seems to be crumbling down around him, right? And so Joseph trusted God's plan because God had a specific mission for Joseph, right? Joseph's mission was to save his entire family and save the entire nation of Egypt. That's what God had in store for him. God didn't necessarily say, here's exactly how it's all going to happen, right? But he told him, eventually, in hindsight, we see that Joseph knows that this was God's mission for him all along, right? And in our context, we know God's mission for us too, right? We don't have all the details, just like Joseph didn't have all the details. But Jesus is very clear that in our context, we have a mission too, right? That's what Matthew 28 says, that our mission is to, one, be disciples, right? We can't make disciples without being disciples. But our mission is to be disciples who make disciples. That's a very specific mission God has given us. But what does Jesus say before he gives the mission to his disciples? He says, behold, I am with you always, right? The presence of Jesus was meant to inform and impact their mission, right? And so it's important because we are there to act in light of that, right? Jesus is there with them, right? He's not there, but he's still there. He's with them, and that should inform our mission as we go out. Right? Because we should be having the attitude that God is here with me. What do I have to lose? Right? God has done all these things in my life. I have seen how he has worked in all these ways, and he's shown me it in his word. So I'm going to live in light and live on mission because I know God is with me. And I'm going to take that leap of faith, just like Joseph. Even though he didn't know what's going on, I'm going to take that leap of faith and live on mission to be a disciple and make disciples. Right? And so as we go out of here, remember that God is with you. And let God's presence transform both your attitude and your actions. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much that you are here. You are a God who is present. You're not a God who just made the world and then leaves us on our own, but you are a God who is there, present with us. And you're not a God who doesn't understand our sufferings, but you're a God who suffered for us. And that you can comfort us in the ways that no other person could. So God, we just thank you for your presence. I pray that we would be people who don't forget that so easily like Jacob, but we would be people who remember that God is with us, whether things are good or whether we're experiencing success. And I pray that this knowledge would lead to attitude change as well. That our hearts would be right. Our hearts would be full of joy. When good things happen, when bad things happen, we would remember that you are there, you are doing something, and that would impact how we feel and our attitudes. And then finally, I pray that we would be bold in light of the fact that you are with us. Jesus, you are with us as we are to be disciples and to make disciples. So I just pray that we would go out of here confident, sharing the good news of Jesus with others you have placed in our lives. So we just pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.